Welcome back to this special program produced by the Coming Home Network International. We're looking at young adults in the church, Clare Piecynski, and Teresa and John Mark Grodi. And the question that I posed before the break was, and I'm thinking about families that might be listening to the story you just said and are glad you're here, but their children are not. So why are you in the faith, in the church, when so many of those your age are gone?
Well, I just want to continue a little bit with what I was talking about earlier, and that's just that an experience that I had and that I saw a lot more of in students around me. I did a little bit of college ministry toward the end of my college experience. We actually did it together, Teresa and I. And so I had a kind of a little bit, obviously not a perfect bird's eye view, but a little bit of a view around some of the newer students who'd kind of gone through some of the same stuff that I had, and seeing that. And one common pattern that I noticed is that a lot of Catholic students who, again, they reach that age of transition, that age of questions that they haven't thought about or addressed maybe in the same way before, that a lot of times their response to those new questions, those new challenges, was one of two directions. The first direction is that they get these new questions, these new ideas, these professors who are challenging them, oftentimes very, very intentionally challenging their faith. Yeah. Sometimes the response is to be afraid of those things, and the response is, there must not be any answer to this, they must be right, and suddenly the whole of the faith just scares them and it just comes crashing down. And we, of course,
if someone that's intelligent.
You're right, yeah. Professor John can't believe this. All this stuff, it must be all not true. My parents must be crazy. We're always tempted to think that.
Yeah. Well,
But I mean, we all know students. Those are some of the Catholic students we've known who they kind of get to a certain point, and then, for quite then a while down the road, we're all wondering, what happened to John? He's out being crazy. What happened to him? And I think that seemed to be something I saw in a lot of students' lives, where they just didn't know what to do with these questions, And the other response to the questions, again, is one of fear, I think, too. I see a lot of students who, like me at one point, the response to the questions was to think, I'm not supposed to go there. To be faithful means I don't question, I don't think about this stuff. If I do, I might lose my faith, whatever that means. And so the response then is to really, it kind of puts a real halting point in their faith, because with any relationship, whether it's a relationship with God or a relationship with a person, once you stop growing that relationship, once you stop, trying to get to know them better, going deeper in that relationship, it really goes stale and kind of dies off a bit. And I think that's what happens again to a lot of students. They begin to fear the questions, and they think that what faith just means is just clenched fist and closed eyes. I just got to hold on to this faith. I don't think that's really what faith is either. But I think there's a lot of fear that students, especially students who've maybe not had much experience of the culture, a lot of times, students who are brought up Catholic or maybe more sheltered, if they're sometimes what they bring with them is their response is just fear to these questions, and then they're off in one or two directions. So that's just something I saw that seemed to result in a lot of people either leaving the faith entirely or kind of turning into those Catholics who are kind of going through the motions, but never really growing, never really
engaging.
Never really engaging.
All right.
So.
All right.
And I think too, sometimes it can be a fear of, if this is true, I'm going to have to change the way I've been living.
Mm-hmm.
There is, if you're convicted of something that's true, you have to respond to that. You might have to, give up, partying late at night. You might have to, move out and not be living with your boyfriend anymore. I think there's really a call that, if this is true, if Jesus Christ really exists, if he has given us a church that is guided into all truth, that has immense consequences for how I would be living my life. And I don't want to deal with that. Yeah. It is a fear of the unknown, of what sort of challenges it would give for me personally. And especially if they haven't experienced the beauty of living a fully Christian, a fully Catholic life, it can be very daunting, because sometimes, especially I think young people look at the church and see a lot of thou shalt nots. And they don't necessarily see the beauty and the teachings of the church, especially on moral issues, in the positive light that they truly exist in. You know, living a chaste life so that you can truly love as God loves, as we are called to love. You know, just not cheating your boss, because, you know, that is, you know, it's just, we live in a culture that is so perverted in the sense of we think things are true or acceptable that really aren't. And to look at the church, to look at Catholicism and see it for what it is, but see, on the other hand, the culture, what we have often been taught or have encountered in college or are encountering. You know, there's such a dichotomy there. And to see that if the church is really, you know, what I'm feeling it is, how is that going to affect how I'm living? And there can be a tremendous amount of fear, a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And sometimes, yeah, we just don't want to deal with those questions.
Yeah, when you're surrounded by so many voices. Last night we were watching this TV show where the junk dealers, the guys going out trying to find things, and they were visiting this one old guy that had hoarded all kinds of stuff. And in the midst of that, the guy jokingly said, well, you know what they say, you know, he who dies with the most toys wins, you know. And after a while, he wasn't selling a thing, and he really believes that. And there are people that really do believe that. In a way, Teresa, you remind me, in your background, of those that come up through the faith, and it may look on the outside that they've got it all, but once you're away from the family, it can be gone right away. And that often happens, that we think our children went through the conveyor belt of the church, and we assume that they came out the other end good and strong, but once they're gone from the family, then we realize they didn't have a good, sound understanding of the faith.
Yeah, and I've been thinking a little bit why there is that, you know, where good old Catholic kids kind of like go crazy, you know, what we were talking about. And it's really something it's the oldest logical like trick in the book, because we see it with Adam and Eve. You know, God told them if they ate that apple, they were going to die. You know, they ate the apple and they didn't die. You know, and it's the exact same thing that's going on in our culture now. You know, like, we're telling people these are bad, these will cause you to go to hell. You know, like, this has ramifications on your soul. You know, and then they do them, and they're like, well, it's not that bad. Yeah, I feel guilt, but it's really not that bad. You know, and we who have the grace to understand God and to understand the church, we need to be living our lives well, like you're saying, like even in the workplace, you know, not cheating your boss, you know, not gossiping, like really making commitments to just be, I hate to use the term Christian witness because it's such a cliche, but just truly being what we're called to be, you know, like speaking with our lives. And again, that's another cliche, but I think people are so used to being preached to that these things that they're doing are wrong, but they're living that life, and obviously they don't feel like it's very wrong, you know. And so having someone who's living this straight, true path that you can trust, that you know you can trust when you're in a bad situation. It's happened, you know, I had my conversion while I was working at the bar, you know, and so I started living that life. I started living a good life, telling people that I couldn't do that anymore, you know, telling people about God and just that I loved him, you know, not in any kind of like a preaching way. But then people would start to come to me, you know, like, Teresa, I have this problem, or, you know, somebody told me this about religion, and, you know, all of a sudden everyone was Catholic, and I never knew it, and they were coming to me because they knew I was Catholic. You know, I never preached, but they knew I was Catholic, and so I lived what they thought a Catholic should be living, you know. And I think really that's the remedy to this situation that we're in, because people know it's wrong, but they're living it. And clearly they're not dead. You know, God hasn't come down and struck them with a lightning bolt.
It's like the frog in the pot, you know.
Yeah.
You can't really tell the heat of the water because he's been in it. It's been warming up. You can't really always tell the ramifications in the big picture when you're in the mire, you know.
Yeah.
I was just thinking you were using the word when you just gave us a couple of great examples of good things, but then you belittled them by saying they were cliches. And it's interesting to think about that.
Yeah.
That why are they cliches?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm hurting. Well, pray for it. That's a cliche. Well, wait a second. Who says it's a cliche?
Yeah.
I'm not criticizing you at all, Teresa, but why is it that the things that we know are true become cliches in a culture because it's part of the soup?
Well,
and I was almost wondering, I wonder if one of the books we should recommend every good Catholic read before they go to college is the Screw Tape Letters.
Absolutely.
I mean, what am I meaning by that? That our college students, when they leave the family, are not aware of the battle they're going to get into for their souls.
Well, also, I mean, one of the reasons I think those things do become cliches is, again, we're not always giving them good examples. We have a lot of things, we have a lot of stuff that's said.
Exactly, right.
You know, I think it's, especially going back to, I really liked what you said, Mary Claire, about kind of the other fear, too, that God might really be real. I mean, we have the fear that God isn't going to be there when I question. We also have the fear that he really is. And there's a great quote by C.S. Lewis about, you know, what happens when the people who've been dabbling in religion really find God. I mean, they didn't really want it to come to that. They weren't quite that serious. You know, but with cliches and with words, I always thought it was interesting how a lot of times people are very uncomfortable talking, using the word Jesus. You know, even a lot of times very seemingly pious people or well, you know, living Catholics can talk lots and lots about all kinds of different stuff and doctrine and this and that and the other. But I think one of the reasons that the name Jesus makes us uncomfortable is because that, on a lot of different levels, Jesus represents God really present in the world. He's no longer just a theory. He's no longer out there, the author looking down in the book. Like he incarnates God in the world. And so in the same way that, you know, or similar way that cliches, I'm not really sure where it's going, but you know.
But to go back to the whole person of Jesus, that is what our Christian life is called to be with. Basically, a relationship with a person, which goes back to even what you were saying earlier. And you know, what does a relationship involve? It revolves, you know, involves communication. You know, I'm sure you guys, you know, understand that being a married couple, it involves a commitment. It involves doing certain things and not doing others. So if there is a person, Jesus, it involves us, you know, being in a relationship with him in a certain way that continually goes deeper and draws us deeper. You know, it's not like your marriage was, you know, an end all be all on your wedding day. It's a continuing journey, and that's where our relationship with Christ, you know, that's what I see even in my own journey. You know, I'm not necessarily a convert in the technical sense of the term, but I am a convert in that, you know, every day I wake up and I choose to try to live a Christian life. That doesn't mean I always do 95% of the time, but that means that it is a continual encounter with Christ and, you know, a continual journey towards him, which hopefully will culminate, you know, in eternal life with him. Which, you know, does bring us back to some of the struggles of, you know, if you don't have, as so many people will say, a personal relationship with Jesus. And sometimes people do feel that lack as Catholics. And I think there's probably a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes it may be, you know, they don't really know the Catholic faith. They
don't understand what the Eucharist means,
right.
Something like that, the intimacy that we have with Jesus
Absolutely.
there in the Eucharist. You know, I was wondering, I want to push you all three a little bit, because a lot of your focus now has been college or after college. Talk about, again, why are you here and not gone in relationship to the local parishes? You're no longer in your Catholic community at college where you had tremendous amount of support. You're no longer at Ave Maria where you had an entire environment of Catholics. You come home to the parishes as young adults. Why are you still here?
Yeah.
I mean, what am I talking about? Is there a problem for young adults at the local parishes? Can there be a problem at the local parish from young adults?
I would say that probably the most difficult period in my life up till now was actually after I graduated college, and even up through now, because I, you know, like you said, I had a wonderful environment during my college years. I was very blessed. I came back, and actually, you know, I got a job with the Coming Home Network, great Catholic environment. However, there wasn't necessarily the support system of young people my age. Yeah. It doesn't necessarily exist on a great level in my local community. Right. And I felt a real lack of connectivity with other people who shared my faith, who shared my interests. And it is hard because it's like, well, you know, do you simply just, you know, hang around the people, you know, at the local bar, or the local this or the local that? Do you know, what sort of things, for one, you know, can you get involved with in your local parish? Are there things?
Sometimes I've wondered, we're all so glad that you're here. There's not a question on that, but I also feel like, have I done you a good thing? Because the Coming Home Network isn't in Washington, D.C.
Right.
or Boston. It's here we are in outside of Zanesville, Ohio, in the middle of a cornfield. So.
Right, and it is hard, and honestly, I've asked myself that same question, and, and I'm like, okay, God, I believe you've put me in this situation, you know, and even relatively recently, perhaps even in the last 6 months or something, I've really felt that God has told me, you know, at least for this point in my life, He wants me to bloom where He planted me. And there have been, you know, some great opportunities He has put in my life, even, you know, ever since I graduated college. But, you know, there is a definite, you know, there's something that, you know, I still long for. You know, sometimes I'm like, oh, I'll just go back to school, you know. But I know that's not necessarily the answer. You know, we are called, like you said in the introduction, you know, to go and preach the gospel to the whole world. And, you know, sometimes that's doing that in the little corner of Zanesville, Ohio that God brings us to. And sometimes it's, you know, it's working in our local parishes, you know, all sorts of things, but there is definitely, or at least I have felt it in my own life, you know, just a real, maybe a disconnect between, you know, I'm on my own, you know, my family's still in the area, but obviously, you know, I'm a single person, you know, with my own life. And how do I fit into the church even at large? You know, I am Catholic, but how does that play out in my day-to-day life? And yeah, that's definitely a struggle I have very much encountered and am still trying to sort through.
Well, you threw out that cliche, bloom where you're planted, but it's a truth. I mean, that's what we're called to do. I mean, that is true. And the two of you come down from your Bowling Green, and you came all the way down here to be near the family, but still, you're a new couple. You are one. It's you, you know. And how do you find your own support system?
Well, I mean, we're coming right out of a very strong Catholic community, and so I mean, we kind of hit the ground running with that, and it's been a great experience for us. We have a great parish and everything. But I mean, I can definitely. One thing I can definitely see is, again, like kind of what we mentioned a bit before, is that it's very clear to children, it's very clear to teenagers, it's very clear to students, you know, as they're growing up, any time there is a contradiction between, you know, a lot of times like what we're saying, you know, and then what we see in people's lives. And, you know, obviously nobody's perfect, parents aren't perfect, leaders in the church aren't perfect, but just like, again, with the name Jesus, with that real relationship with Christ, it's very apparent to these students when there's all kinds of stuff being said, but where's the stuff in the heart, you know? I mean, sometimes those it's hard to get down to the real meat of it, because a lot of times people are tired of hearing a lot of the words, but never really seeing the real heart of it. And I think that's sometimes the struggle that when, you know, a student gets kind of off on their own parish, their own system, is they may have never had the best examples of that anyway. But then again, in a parish, a lot of these people, you don't know them very well, and it's just more words and trying for them to really, again, to connect with what's the faith really about, you know, and they can remain, a lot of people can remain for most of their lives just caught up in a lot of the words but never really know Christ. So that's a problem with a lot of people face.
Is there a danger? I feel in danger in asking this because I got my son at the table here, but Mark Twain made that statement about when I was 10, my parents knew everything. When I was 20, they knew nothing. And when I was 30, I realized I was right when I was 10. You know? And I'm wondering if some of the struggles for young adults when they leave the home and they go away to college and learn a lot of stuff can sometimes land afterwards thinking they know more than the people in the local parish. They can, you know, they land, and it takes a while for them to appreciate the great wisdom that's there in the saints of the local parish. Have you experienced any of that? I wonder if that leads to some alienation for young adults to find themselves in when they come back to the parish.
Yeah. I think I've experienced both, and both in a way are kind of justified. Like, first of all, you know, when you leave a vibrant youth, you know, like where everyone is just, there's 80 people at daily mass, you know, and everybody, like the big thing during the week is adoration, night of worship, you know. You do come back to this parish or a parish, you know, I'm in a different parish now, and you kind of, and nothing against our parish is wonderful, but, you know, you start to realize, like, your heart starts to break, like there are people who are living without Christ every day, you know, they're coming here only on Sunday, and that's it, you know, and they're here because their kids are going to the Catholic school, or, you know, and it breaks your heart, and you do, because you recognize that you've been given the gift of, like, feeling on fire, or at least feeling like your religion is true, which so many people don't. You know, that you're like, well, I should get involved and I should start doing things, and I don't think that that's wrong. But at the same time, something that helped me, that was kind of, I don't know if it's unique to my conversion, but you must see it a lot, bringing people into the universal church. But very, very soon after my conversion, I went on pilgrimages to Europe, you know, and I experienced a culture that we don't have here. Catholics here are kind of on a defensive always, because it's not a Catholic country. You know, we're always defending ourselves.
Should have been, but we lost it real quick, sadly.
Yeah, and we do have a history of persecution, a little bit. Nothing that any of our ancestors dealt with, but and then going to visit a country or a continent where everything's Catholic. Everything's named after a Catholic saint, or there's, you know, 1,000-year-old frescoes on the wall, you know, and going to the Vatican and just experiencing the universality of the church, you know, even coming to a parish where you don't feel like it's Catholic, you know, like it's everybody's up in arms and everybody is pushing each other out of the way to sign up for adoration, you know. You still understand that the church is universal, and that the most important thing for you are those sacraments, you know, and knowing that even in my home when I can't go to mass, or I can't, you know, like I can be present with the church in prayer, you know, and so that's helped a lot, and it helps also keep you humble, because you understand that you're not everything. You're not 2,000 years of the church's history.
Yeah, we're all
you know?
on journeys, and we always have to be careful of projecting or judging other folk. But I do want you to address, though, a question that I could envision at least somebody out there asking, because I've encountered it a bunch of times. And maybe it was the reason the Journey Home program was started in the first place. Parents whose children have left, and they feel hopeless about getting them back. And they might be asking the question to themselves, what did I do wrong? When you think about the people your age that are not in the faith, have left the faith, what would you say to parents that feel that way? What did I do wrong? What did I do wrong?
I was actually thinking about that earlier. And knowing lots of people who grew up in cradle Catholic families, maybe whose parents experienced a conversion in their life, I think sometimes parents are scared that their kids are going to do what they did, you know, and they see the mistakes, and as kids, you know, they don't want to hear, you know, what their parents have done, and they don't think that their parents have, you know, experienced anything once they start living life, you know, like my parents don't know what I'm talking about, you know, and I think parents are scared to let their kids, you know, like, sometimes I see a lot of, like, really, really white-knuckled Catholic parents who are so concerned with telling their kids what's right, and we experience this even when we're talking to non-Catholics. Sometimes you hear what they're saying and you know how you want to jump on it right away. You know what you want to tell them about the faith that's true, because you want to show them that they're wrong in a good way. You want to share the truth with them. And it's kind of the same sometimes with parents. They're caught up in telling and not in the listening. And a gift that my mom gave me that was very beautiful is that I had all kinds of thoughts when I was growing up. They were very contradictory to the Catholic Church, but she listened, and she loved me, and she listened, even though it was hard for her and it was painful for her. And every once in a while, she'd tell me, like, this is what I think, and I know that this is hard, a hard situation you're going through, but she listened first. She wanted to know what I was going through first, and that taught me a lot from my mom about humility, like she wasn't, even though I'm sure she wanted to be in control and she wanted to make sure that I came out, perfect, like she cared about me first, and she knew that through her persistence in prayers and through just loving, that eventually I would come back, which I would, and ask her, like, what am I supposed to do, Mom? And like all these things about the Catholic faith that I'm finally understanding. And then I was here. It's kind of like being able to trust God, basically. Praying and loving and trusting God.
That listening is so important. Listening is so important, like you said. And I think one thing it seemed to teach you that your mom taught you through that is kind of a whole attitude toward truth, where when she was trying to love you and figure out what to do, when my daughter's going through this or the other, her main focus was on loving you, even before the information and the data and all things she could be saying, and she was trying to listen to. And I think that what listening, Dad, you've talked about before about how when you listen, you earn the right to speak, and that's a big part of it too. But I think the listening really teaches the proper attitude toward truth, toward information. A lot of times we want to jump in and we have our hands on it too much, but yeah.
And that brings up a quote that I love by Mother Teresa that says, we're called to faithfulness, not necessarily success. And in that I see that, a Catholic parent who has, done everything that, they can think of, that they can possibly do to ensure that their child, has a solid, education in the faith. And, sometimes they have to realize they really just have to give that child to God and say, what, I am going to be faithful with my prayers, my sacrifices, my fastings, and sometimes, parents can say, oh, I'm praying for my kids, but, are you making little sacrifices too, to go along? Maybe it might be, giving up, something that you really enjoy, as a particular sacrifice to let, to make those graces be perhaps available to your child so that they could come, back to the church. But I think a important aspect too is, we are called to be faithful in our lives, but our, the person's child, has free will and has to respond to God's grace themselves. We can't force that. And that, the parent has to be faithful, but not necessarily expect tangible results that they might be expecting or hoping for.
It's got to be God's timing. One mysterious aspect of conversion, which we really don't talk that much about because it's a bit controversial, and that is, we know in Scripture that God, according to His wisdom, closes eyes and ears to the gospel. He did that for Israel. Jesus said that they may not hear, that they may not see. Why does God do that? We don't know, but often it's a timing issue, so that you came to faith back to faith at a time that was right for you. You did too. I did too at age 21. You did too. Even, we all did that. And there's a time when why can't we get this person to hear? I don't know. The mystery of grace. So that's why we use the illustration recently. We're talking about that those men that were told to walk around Jericho and to blow their horns laughed that this is going to have anything to do with breaking down that wall. But God said, just do it. Yeah. And the walls fell. That's evangelization. We don't know what breaks down the walls. We're just called to tell and to witness and to love and to pray and to listen. That's our part of it.
Right. Well, I also think, like with that quote about focusing on faithfulness versus success, it's really, I think that really translates very well in some in practical advice, because what faithfulness is what we do. Success is an outcome. Okay, we can't. It's like a difference between an action and a project. I mean, you can't do a project. A project is composed of many actions. You do actions, and so we're not responsible for the outcome of any situation. And a lot of times it's easy because we're focused on the outcomes. It's easy to become frustrated or anxious or worried. And especially with parents, you might feel that way. That I did something wrong because the outcome. I'm not responsible for the outcome. That also turns around and translates into, okay, so what are my actions? And a lot of times if we really get clear with those, it turns out that maybe the things we should be doing first, sometimes again, like you said, are listening, or simply just loving, simply just prayer, the things that we can actually do. It's easy to kind of see the outcomes and to focus on those and to forget the little things, like you said, the little sacrifices, things that we can do.
Okay. Why don't we take a pause in that? I'll take another break, and then we come back. Okay, let's look at some solutions. What are some ideas of what we can do at the local level to help our listeners? Maybe one thing, get hope for their own siblings or children that are gone. What can we do to reach back out to them? All right, come back just a little bit.